There is a particular kind of laughter that doesn't mean anything is funny. I know that laughter well. I grew up inside it. It's the laughter that fills a room when someone needs the tension redirected, when a joke lands at someone else's expense, and everyone decides, collectively and wordlessly, that laughing is easier than questioning whether the joke was kind. It's the laughter of people who have agreed, without ever saying so out loud, that one person at the table is fair game. That person, in my family, has always been me. My name is Danny Voss. I'm 28 years old. I grew up in Naperville, Illinois, the younger of two daughters in a family that valued appearances the way some families value scripture, with devotion, with vigilance, and with a particular hostility toward anything that threatened to disturb the picture. My older sister, Courtney, was everything my parents pointed to when they needed evidence that they had done something right. She was pretty, organized, socially fluent, and had the specific talent of making authority figures feel appreciated. She got good grades without seeming to try. She made friends easily. She remembered birthdays. She never, not once in her entire childhood, embarrassed anyone at a dinner party. I was the other one. Not bad exactly. Not troubled, not failing. Just different in ways that made my parents tired. Too quiet in rooms where I was supposed to perform, too vocal in moments where I was supposed to be decorative. I asked too many questions. I left parties early. I chose majors and jobs that couldn't be summarized in a single impressive sentence. I had always been a source of low-grade anxiety for my family. The way a weather forecast that won't commit to sunshine or rain is a source of low-grade anxiety for people planning an outdoor event. They didn't dislike me. I want to be fair about that. They just didn't know what to do with me. And in my family, not knowing what to do with something meant quietly setting it aside and focusing on what was easier to understand. What was easy to understand was Courtney. And by extension, the man Courtney brought home that Thanksgiving. The man who, within 45 minutes of sitting down at my parents' dining room table, decided he understood exactly what kind of person I was. His name was Preston Hale, and everything that followed started with him. I should tell you what I was doing at the time, because it matters to everything that comes after. For the previous 14 months, I had been working as an independent financial forensics consultant, which is a job title that makes people's eyes glaze over at dinner parties and means, in plain language, that companies and law firms hired me to find things in financial records that other people had tried to hide. I had spent 4 years before that at a mid-sized accounting firm in Chicago doing fraud examination work. The painstaking, unglamorous process of tracing money through corporate structures, identifying irregularities, documenting discrepancies, building the kind of paper trail that eventually becomes evidence. I was good at it. I was, if I'm being entirely honest, very good at it. I had a particular gift for pattern recognition, for the way numbers tell stories when you know how to read them, for the quiet language of financial documents that most people find impenetrable, and I found, genuinely, almost incomprehensibly to the people who knew me, interesting. But none of that translated well to my parents' dinner table. My mother, when pressed to explain what I did to her friends, said I worked in accounting with the tone of someone describing a chronic but non-fatal condition. My father, who had spent his career in commercial real estate and understood success primarily in terms of visible assets and legible titles, had once introduced me to his business partner as the one who's still figuring things out. I had been doing financially stable, intellectually demanding, genuinely skilled work for 4 years. I was, by any measurable standard, not still figuring things out. But in my family's taxonomy, I hadn't produced anything they could brag about. I didn't have a corner office. I didn't have a corporate title. I worked alone, mostly from home, occasionally from client sites. My LinkedIn profile was deliberately sparse because the nature of my work required discretion. I drove a sensible used car. I didn't own a home yet. And so, by the only metrics my family applied with any consistency, I registered as underperforming. This is the context in which Preston Hale met me. Thanksgiving at my parents' house in Naperville followed a template that had barely varied since I was 12 years old. My mother cooked for 3 days and then apologized for the food throughout the meal. My father opened wine. He had been saving and talked about it with more passion than he brought to most human relationships. Extended family arrived in shifts and circled through the kitchen making noises of appreciation. Children ran through the house in socks. Someone inevitably brought up the housing market. I drove down from Chicago the morning of, arrived at noon, and immediately understood that this year's gathering had a different center of gravity. Courtney and Preston had been together for 7 months. This was the introduction, the formal one, the one that my parents had clearly been anticipating with the kind of restrained excitement they normally reserved for home renovation reveals. I could tell from the moment I walked in, from the way my mother had set the good table linens out, from the way my father was wearing a collared shirt on a holiday when he almost never wore collared shirts, that today was not just Thanksgiving. Today was an audition, and Preston was the one being considered for a role, and everyone except me had already decided he was going to get it. He was 34 tall, and carried himself with the breezy authority of someone who had never seriously doubted that a room would be glad he'd arrived. He had sandy blonde hair, good posture, and the kind of generic handsomeness that photographs well. He worked in private wealth management. His words, delivered in the first 3 minutes, with just enough casualness to suggest he was too secure to need to impress anyone, which is, of course, its own form of impression management. My parents loved him immediately. I could see it happening in real time, the way my mother's shoulders dropped with relief, the way my father leaned forward to ask a follow-up question. Courtney glowed beside him. The whole scene had the quality of a jigsaw puzzle where all the pieces were clicking into place with satisfying precision, and I was, as I had always been, the piece that didn't quite fit the section everyone else was working on. I helped in the kitchen. I carried dishes. I sat where I was told to sit. I did what I always did at family events, which was to participate quietly and wait for the part where I could go home. The meal started well enough. The conversation moved in its usual holiday patterns, updates on relatives, comments on the food, a story my father told that I had heard before but laughed at anyway. Preston was charming in the uncomplicated way that some people are simply wired to be, easy with compliments, quick with humor, attentive in the way that reads as interest whether or not it actually is. My mother kept touching his arm. My father kept calling him son before catching himself, as if they were already 3 years into knowing each other. I was fine with all of it. I want to be clear about that. I had no particular feelings about Preston Hale in those first hours. I didn't resent him. I wasn't jealous of the attention he received. I had long since stopped auditing how much warmth flowed in my direction versus Courtney's. That accounting had only ever made me sad. What changed things was something much smaller than a revelation. It was a question. We were somewhere between the main course and the pie when my mother, in the way that mothers do when they want to demonstrate to a guest that the whole family is conversationally present, turned to me and said, "Danny, tell Preston what you're working on these days." It was not a genuine invitation. I recognized it for what it was, a setup, an opportunity for the table to see that even the complicated daughter had something to contribute. The catch was that my mother did not actually know what I was working on, because she had never asked. What she knew was what I had told her the year before, that I had left my firm and was consulting independently. Which, through the particular translation process that governed my family's understanding of my life, had become, Danny is between things. I gave a brief, honest answer. I said I was consulting in financial forensics and had been working with a law firm in Chicago on a case. My mother nodded with the polite blankness of someone who had not understood the answer, but appreciated its brevity. Preston tilted his head. "Financial forensics," he said. "Is that like auditing?" "Adjacent," I said. "Fraud examination mostly, tracing irregular transactions, documenting discrepancies for litigation support." He nodded in the way people nod when they are not actually processing what you said but want to appear engaged. "That's interesting." A pause. "Are you with a firm?" "I'm independent right now," I said. "Have been for just over a year." And there it was, the shift. I saw it cross his face before he covered it, a small, involuntary recalibration, the kind that happens when a person files new information into a pre-existing category. Independent consultant had landed, in Preston Hale's understanding, directly on top of the category marked between things. Nice, he said, and the word had the quality of a door closing gently. Good to have flexibility. He moved on. The table moved on. But about 10 minutes later, after my father had refilled everyone's wine and the conversation had found a comfortable rhythm again, Preston said something that I want to try to describe accurately, because it was not a shout. It was not an attack. It was the kind of thing that is worse than those things, because it came wrapped in the language of humor and couldn't be contested without making you the humorless one. He was talking about one of his college friends, someone who had, he said, wandered through his 20s not really committing to anything. A guy who was brilliant, honestly, but never figured out how to channel it. He told this story with warmth, with affection, but underneath it was a structure I recognized. He was building toward something, using the friend as a safe way to say what he actually wanted to say. Some people just need more time, he concluded, with a generous, open expression that invited the room to agree. Then he glanced at me, not a long look, barely a second, and added, "Nothing wrong with the scenic route." My mother laughed. It was the same laugh I described at the beginning, the one that doesn't mean anything is funny. My father smiled into his wine glass. Courtney looked at her plate. The scenic route. As if I were a person ambling through a landscape, taking in the view, enjoying a leisurely journey toward a destination I hadn't yet identified. I did not say anything. I smiled slightly, reached for my water glass, and filed the moment away with careful, meticulous attention. Because the other thing that had happened, underneath the comment, woven into the story he had been telling about his directionless friend, was something else, something that had nothing to do with me. Preston had mentioned, in passing, a name, a company name, a specific fund he said he had helped structure for a client a few years back, before he'd moved into his current role. The name sat in my mind like a stone dropped in still water, spreading small, quiet rings. I knew that name, and the thing I knew about it was not compatible with the thing he had just said. I drove back to Chicago that evening feeling neither angry nor vindicated. I felt the way I always feel when something comes into focus after a long period of blur, alert, interested, and very, very patient. I did not rush home and immediately start researching. I made tea. I watched 40 minutes of television without retaining any of it. I sat with the low hum of what I had noticed and let it settle before I decided what to do with it. Here is what I knew about the fund Preston had mentioned. 18 months earlier, I had done preliminary work on a case that a small Chicago law firm had brought to me, a civil dispute involving a private investment fund that had allegedly misrepresented its structure to a group of limited partners. The case had not moved forward. The client had settled out of court, and I had been paid for the weeks I had put in and moved on. But I have a good memory for the names that pass through my work, the same way a librarian has a good memory for books they've handled. The fund Preston mentioned was one I had touched, briefly, on the periphery of that work. And the thing that had been alleged about that fund, the thing that had generated enough concern for a law firm to bring in a forensic examiner, even temporarily, was not compatible with the story of someone having helped structure it successfully as a professional achievement. It was compatible with something else. I sat with that knowledge for 2 days before I did anything. On the third day, I opened my laptop. I want to be precise about what I did, because it matters for understanding what I found. I did not do anything improper. I did not access information I wasn't entitled to access. Everything I used was drawn from public records: SEC filings, state business registrations, court documents available through PACER, the federal court database that any citizen can search. Financial forensics runs on public records. The skill isn't having access to secret information. The skill is knowing where the public information is, knowing what it means, and knowing how to follow it when it branches. I spent the first afternoon on basic entity searches. Preston Hale appeared in public records as a registered investment advisor, licensed in Illinois, affiliated with 2 successive wealth management firms over the past 8 years. Exactly the resume he had described. Clean, straightforward, nothing alarming. I moved to the fund. What I found took longer, but the outlines were visible within a few hours for anyone who knew what to look for. The fund had been registered as a private placement, exempt from certain SEC reporting requirements, standard for a fund of its type. But the registration documentation contained an anomaly I had seen before. A secondary managing entity, a pass-through structure with a different name, registered in Delaware 4 months before the fund launched, with a registered agent address that was a mail forwarding service. Also standard in isolation, not standard in combination with what came next. The pass-through entity appeared in 2 other filings. One was a small civil suit, dismissed, but with a documented settlement payment, involving an investor who had alleged material misrepresentation about the fund's underlying assets. The second was an amended filing, submitted 8 months after the fund's launch, quietly correcting the stated investment strategy and language that was technically accurate but substantively different from the original description. Preston Hale's name did not appear in any of these documents. He had been careful, or lucky, or perhaps genuinely unaware. I had learned, in 4 years of this work, that the distance between those 3 conditions was often smaller than people assumed. But a second name appeared in the pass-through entity's registration. A business partner, listed as co-manager. Someone who, according to their own LinkedIn profile, had worked at the same wealth management firm as Preston Hale for 3 years, overlapping entirely with the period when the fund was active. I sat back in my chair. I wasn't looking at a crime. I was looking at a pattern. And in financial forensics, a pattern is not a conclusion. It is a question that demands an answer. The question I now had was straightforward. Had Preston Hale knowingly associated himself with a fund that had misrepresented its structure to investors, and then described that association, at my parents' Thanksgiving table, as a professional accomplishment? I didn't know, but I knew how to find out more. And I knew, with the specific certainty that comes from years of this work, that the answer mattered. Not to me personally, to my sister. Courtney and I had never been close in the way some sisters are close. We were not enemies. We did not have screaming fights or long-standing feuds. We had something quieter and, in its own way, more painful. A relationship that had been slowly formatted by our family's dynamics into something transactional and distant, where I was the difficult one, and she was the successful one, and neither of us had ever quite pushed back against those assigned roles hard enough to escape them. I did not know if Courtney loved Preston. I suspected she did, or believed she did, which in the early months of a relationship is often the same thing. I knew she was happy, or performing happiness with enough conviction that the difference was invisible from the outside. I knew my parents adored him. I knew that the momentum of that approval was powerful, that it had the specific gravitational pull of family consensus, which is one of the hardest forces in human experience to move against. I also knew something else. I knew that my sister was not a stupid woman. She was careful with money. I had watched her balance a checkbook with the precision of someone who had learned early that financial miscalculation had consequences. She had worked hard for what she had. She owned her condo outright. She had a modest but real investment portfolio that she managed conservatively. If Preston Hale had a history of proximity to financial misrepresentation, even as a peripheral figure, even without direct culpability, she deserved to know that before she went any further. I was not going to be the person who kept that from her, because it was uncomfortable. I spent 3 more days documenting what I had found, not in the breathless, speculative language of someone with a grudge, but in the careful, sourced, footnoted language of a professional presenting findings to a client. I cross-referenced every claim. I noted where evidence was direct and where it was circumstantial. I was ruthless about separating what I knew from what I suspected, and I labeled the difference clearly at every point. When I finished, I had a 12-page memo, clean and unemotional, with 23 public document citations. I was not going to hand it to my parents. They would have dismissed it as jealousy without reading past the first paragraph. I was not going to send it to Courtney by email, where the medium itself, the cold, distant formality of a document delivered electronically, would have made it easy for her to receive it as an attack rather than an act of concern. I called her, and asked if we could meet for coffee. She sounded surprised. We had not had a one-on-one conversation, just the two of us, in probably 4 months. She said yes after a brief hesitation that I understood. She was calculating what I might want, whether this was going to be unpleasant, whether she had the bandwidth for whatever was coming. "I'm not going to make this a whole thing," I told her on the phone, which I knew was exactly what someone about to make it a whole thing would say. "I just need to show you something, and then what you do with it is entirely up to you." We met at a coffee shop in Lincoln Park, 2 weeks before Christmas. Courtney arrived looking polished and a little guarded. She had her coat buttoned all the way up, which for Courtney is a form of body language. She ordered a latte and sat across from me with the careful composure of someone prepared for an argument. I didn't give her one. I put the memo on the table. I didn't slide it dramatically across. I just set it there and said, "I need you to read this, all of it. And I need you to know that I spent a week making sure everything in here is sourced and accurate because I wasn't willing to come to you with anything I wasn't certain of." She looked at the document, then at me. "What is this?" "It's about Preston," I said. "Specifically about a fund he mentioned at Thanksgiving. I recognized the name and I did some research." A beat, her jaw tightened slightly. "Danny." "I know," I said. "I know what you're thinking. I know how this looks. I'm asking you to read it anyway." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she picked up the memo. She read slowly. I watched her face. I am good at reading faces. It's part of the work, the ability to observe without projecting, to notice without interpreting. What I saw in Courtney's face as she read was not what I had expected. I had anticipated defensiveness. I had anticipated the progressive stiffening of someone whose loyalties were being challenged. What I saw instead was recognition. Not surprise. Recognition, the specific expression of someone encountering information that confirms something they had already half known and had been working to suppress. She read for nearly 20 minutes. She turned pages without comment. When she reached the final page and its sourced summary, she set the memo down and looked at the table for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, "He told me that fund was one of his biggest professional wins." "I know," I said. "He mentioned it in our 3rd week of dating. He used it to explain why he was good at what he did, said he had helped structure the strategy." She paused. "He never mentioned the civil suit." "It was settled confidentially," I said. "It's not something you'd know to look for unless you had a reason to look." She was quiet again. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were red at the edges, not crying, but close. "I've had questions," she said. "Small ones, things that didn't quite add up. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was sabotaging something good because I wasn't used to things being good." "You weren't being paranoid," I said. We sat together for a while without speaking. The coffee shop moved around us, baristas calling names, the door opening and closing with gusts of December cold, the ordinary texture of a weekday afternoon going about its business, indifferent to what was happening at our table. "What do I do with this?" she said finally. "Whatever you decide is right," I told her. "That's why I brought it to you and not to Mom and Dad. This is your life. You get to decide how you respond." She nodded slowly. Then she said something I had not expected, had not prepared myself to hear. "Why did you come to me at all? You know how I've treated you. At Thanksgiving, I didn't say anything. When he made that comment, I just sat there." I considered my answer carefully. "Because you're my sister," I said, "and I'm better at this than most people. It would have been a choice to not use that." She wiped the corner of her eye with the back of her hand, quickly, the way people do when they're embarrassed to be emotional. "I didn't know what you actually did for work," she admitted. "I mean, I knew the title, but I didn't understand it." "Mom describes it as accounting," I said. She let out something between a laugh and a breath. "Yeah. I've been okay with that," I said. "I don't need you to understand my job to know it's real." She looked at me for a moment, really looked, the way that's different from the cursory social glance of people who share a table. "I think I've been a pretty bad sister," she said. "I think we both got shaped into things by our family that we didn't choose," I said. And I think it's not too late to be different. What happened after is not entirely mine to tell, because it belongs to Courtney as much as it belongs to me. What I can tell you is this. She confronted Preston directly, alone, with the memo and her own questions. The conversation apparently lasted 3 hours. I was not there for it, but she called me afterward, and from the way she sounded stripped of the polished composure that usually shaped her voice, tired and clear-eyed and genuine in a way I hadn't heard from her in years, I understood that it had not gone well for Preston's version of himself. He had explanations. He had context. He had the practiced plausibility of someone who had navigated uncomfortable questions before. But Courtney, it turned out, had been suppressing sharper instincts than either of us had given her credit for. With the documentation in front of her and her own accumulated doubts finally permitted to speak, she asked questions he couldn't answer cleanly. The engagement ended 3 weeks before Christmas. My parents, as expected, responded initially with versions of blame directed at me. My mother, in a phone call I let go to voicemail and listened to twice before responding, said that I had inserted myself into something that wasn't my business, and that Courtney was devastated. My father sent a text that was more controlled, but communicated the same substance. I called my mother back and said, calmly and without drama, that I understood she was upset, and that I had brought what I found to Courtney privately and let her make her own decision, and that I would do it again. My mother said she didn't understand me. I know, I said, but I'm okay with that. It was the truest thing I had said to her in a long time. Christmas that year was different. Smaller, my mother and father had a quiet dinner with Courtney, who was still raw but present. I drove down from Chicago and sat at a table that felt strange without the performance of it, without the careful maintenance of an image that required everyone to play their assigned role. Courtney and I talked for 2 hours that evening, after our parents had gone to bed. Really talked. About the years, about the roles, about the particular damage done by families who assign their children identities before those children have had any chance to form their own. It was not a perfect conversation. We are not a movie, and 2 hours does not undo years. But it was real, and real was something we had not managed before. She asked me, at some point, how I had known what to look for in the documents, how I had known that one passing reference to a fund name at a dinner table was worth following. I didn't know, I said. I just paid attention, and then I followed what the attention led to. She shook her head slowly. You've been doing something genuinely impressive this whole time, and none of us ever bothered to actually ask. No, I said. I'm asking now, she said. So I told her, all of it, what the work actually was, what it required, what it felt like to trace a financial discrepancy through 40 pages of public filings until the pattern revealed itself. She listened with her whole face, the way she hadn't since we were children telling each other things we actually cared about. And when I finished, she said, very simply, I'm proud of you. I had waited 28 years to hear my sister say that. I had spent enough of those years deciding I didn't need it that I had half convinced myself it was true. It wasn't true, I needed it, and she said it, and that was enough. I want to be honest about what this story is not. It is not a story about justice. Exactly, though there is some of that in it. It is not a story about a bad man getting what he deserved, though I believe in accountability and I am not sorry for the role I played. It is not a story about being smarter than everyone in the room, which is a narrative I find corrosive even when it's accurate. What it is, I think, is a story about the cost of allowing the people who love you to define you, and about what happens when you stop paying that cost. For most of my life, I had accepted a version of myself that my family had authored, not because I believed it, but because fighting it required energy I kept deciding to spend elsewhere. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was above it. I told myself that the work I did and the life I lived spoke for itself, regardless of whether the people at my Thanksgiving table could hear what it was saying. And then a man I barely knew made a comment about the scenic route, and I felt something I had been suppressing for years clarify into something usable. Not anger, resolve. The difference matters. Anger wants to be witnessed. Resolve just wants to get the work done. I got the work done. And when it was finished, I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel superior. I felt something quieter and more durable than either of those things. I felt like myself, like the full version, not the edited one. That is what I would want anyone to take from this, more than the details of the story, more than anything about fraud or family or the particular mechanics of public financial records. The version of you that other people find inconvenient, the one that asks too many questions, takes up the wrong kind of space, refuses to stay in the lane they've designated. That version is not the problem. That version is frequently the only one in the room, paying close enough attention to catch what everyone else has missed. Don't sand it down to make them comfortable. You'll need it.